Why did the silence feel louder than the gunfire? The swamp had gone still in a way that didn't belong to nature. Snow drifted down in soft, lazy spirals, settling into reeds and frozen water like ash after a fire. Captain Marcus Fletcher lay pressed into the ice, every breath fogging white in front of his face, his chest tight with the instinct that told him something was wrong long before bullets confirmed it. The mission had looked clean on paper. Too clean. Satellite images showed nothing but frozen marsh, a cabin and access road. No red flags, no alarms. And yet here they were, trapped. Boots sank with sickening slowness into half-frozen mud as enemy rounds cut through the ice like knives. Radio chatter was useless, static, breathing, fragments of panic. No air support, no quick reaction force, no way out. The cabin they'd crossed 2 kilometers of frozen hell to reach was empty, the coffee still warm, the chairs barely cooled. Whoever they were hunting had known they were coming, had planned this. When the first rounds came from 3 directions at once, Fletcher didn't shout. He didn't panic. Training took over. Orders came clipped. Movements were small, precise. But inside, something colder than the swamp settled in his gut. This wasn't an ambush meant to scare them off. It was meant to erase them. As the firing intensified, Corporal Brooks went down. A scream cut short. Blood spread bright and unforgiving across white snow. Haze laid down suppressive fire, controlled but thinning. Ammo was disappearing faster than time. Fletcher dragged Brooks back, every step a punishment, every second a gamble. The tourniquet barely slowed the bleeding. The medic didn't look up when he shook his head. 30 minutes, maybe less. Fletcher keyed his radio again, cycling frequencies, voice tight but steady. Nothing answered him. Just static. Just silence. And then, as the enemy repositioned, boots crunching closer, voices barking orders in a language he didn't understand, Fletcher felt something unfamiliar. Acceptance. Not surrender, something quieter. The understanding that sometimes, no matter how prepared you are, the world decides otherwise. He checked his magazine. 11 rounds. He slid it back in, chambered one, and leaned into the frozen timber. If this was where it ended, they'd end standing. Then the radio hissed. Not static. A voice faint, controlled female. All Viper elements, do you copy? For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. This is Viper 1, Fletcher answered, afraid the sound might vanish if he spoke too loudly. Identify yourself. The transmission wavered, then cleared just enough. Night Viper, I'm on you. And somewhere in the storm, something shifted. Who fires once and changes everything? The first shot didn't sound like rescue. It sounded like punctuation. A sharp, distant crack followed by silence where an enemy voice had been seconds before. Fletcher lifted his head just enough to see confusion ripple through the hostile lines. Then another shot, from a different direction. Another body dropped. No aircraft, no thunder, just precision. The enemy formation hesitated. Their advance slowed. Voices rose, not commands now, but questions. Fletcher felt it before he fully understood it. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. Remain in position, the voice said calmly. Do not engage unless fired upon. Whoever she was, she didn't shout, didn't rush. She spoke like someone who had already decided how this would end. Shots continued, each from a new angle, each impossibly clean. The hostile force began to fracture, firing wildly into shadows that no longer held targets. Fletcher's disbelief turned into something else. Awe maybe, or fear of a different kind. No team operated like this. No one moved that fast, that accurately alone. He asked again who she was. Someone preventing you from dying today, she replied. Focus on staying alive. She identified the jamming unit within minutes, eliminated it without ceremony. Communications flooded back like oxygen. Headquarters responded. A helicopter lifted, 12 minutes out. But survival wasn't sudden. It was earned inch by inch. She guided them south, calling threats before they appeared. Every time an enemy tried to reposition, they died before they could fire. Fletcher carried Brooks until his shoulders screamed, until his legs shook, until the only thing moving him forward was the sound of that voice in his ear, steady and unbreakable. When they reached the clearing, a truck blocked the landing zone. Mounted gun, 4 hostiles. Fletcher stopped, knowing they didn't have the ammo. "I've got it," she said. 4 shots, 4 bodies, less than 2 seconds. No flourish, no pause. Just action. The helicopter descended like something unreal, rotors tearing at snow and silence alike. They loaded Brooks first, then the rest. Fletcher turned back once, scanning the storm, searching for a shape, a shadow, anything. There was nothing. Only snow. "Thank you," he said into the radio, knowing it wasn't enough. "You're welcome," she answered, exhaustion finally leaking through. "Get them home." The line went dead. What kind of person saves lives and disappears? 3 days later, Fletcher sat across from a general he'd never met, listening to rules that erased truth with efficiency. Night Viper was classified, her identity sealed, her involvement denied. The official report would credit Allied assistance and exceptional team performance. Fletcher argued once, then stopped. Because he understood. Some tools only work if they stay invisible. He told his men. They were quiet about it, disappointed but alive. Gratitude didn't need permission. 2 weeks later, Fletcher wrote a letter he would never send. He wrote names, families, futures that still existed because a woman he would never meet chose to step into a storm alone. He locked it away. 3,000 miles from the marsh, Elena Cruz stared at a hospital ceiling, her body wrapped in bandages, her hands shaking despite the warmth. Hypothermia had nearly taken her. The ice had broken beneath her during the jamming unit approach. The water had stolen her breath, her strength, her time. She crawled out anyway. Because 4 men were counting on her. A handler asked questions. She gave none that mattered. Authorization was discussed. Oversight, concerns. She listened, then said what she always said. Someone had to answer the call. She didn't do this for recognition. She did it because patterns repeated, because traps were predictable if you watched closely enough, because silence killed faster than bullets, and because dignity didn't need an audience. What happens after the voice goes quiet? 6 weeks later, Fletcher briefed intelligence officers who pretended not to believe him. He didn't embellish. He didn't beg. He just told the truth until it was buried under classification. When asked if he'd want an asset like that exposed, he said no. Outside, his team waited. Brooks leaned on a cane, alive, smiling. They walked together in silence, carrying something no report could capture. Elsewhere, Elena prepared for another disappearance, another storm, another call buried in static. She would answer it. She always did. Because somewhere, someone would need to hear calm in chaos. And sometimes strength doesn't shout. It simply says, "I'm on you." Do you breathe when the fight suddenly stops, but death hasn't? The silence after the first shots felt wrong. Not relief, not safety, just absence. As if the swamp itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Captain Marcus Fletcher stayed pressed against the frozen timber, cheek burning against the ice, ears straining for anything that explained what they just heard. One crack, then another, clean, distant, final. Not the chaotic sound of 2 forces colliding, but something deliberate, surgical. He didn't move. None of them did. Years of training had taught Fletcher one rule that mattered above all others. When something unexpected happens in combat, don't rush to name it. Observe it. Let it reveal itself. Surprise was dangerous, but assumption was fatal. And whatever had just intervened in their slow execution didn't behave like anything he recognized. Hayes shifted slightly beside him, boots scraping ice by accident. Fletcher raised a fist instantly. Freeze. Hayes went still. Brooks groaned softly, unconscious now, breath shallow and uneven. Pierce kept pressure on the wound, eyes flicking up every few seconds, fear and calculation wrestling behind them. Vega watched the eastern reads through his optic, jaw clenched so tightly Fletcher could see the muscle jumping. Then the radio crackled again. "Remain still," the woman said, calm, low, as if she were sitting in a warm room with a map laid out in front of her instead of crouched somewhere in a blizzard surrounded by enemies. "They're trying to locate me. Let them fail." Fletcher swallowed. He keyed the mic but hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Something about her tone made him feel like interrupting would be a mistake. Another shot rang out, closer this time. A body fell somewhere beyond the reeds to the north. He heard shouting now, sharp, urgent, no longer confident. The enemy was no longer executing a plan. They were reacting. "Who are you?" Fletcher finally asked. A pause, not long but intentional, like she was deciding whether the question mattered. "Focus on what's in front of you, Captain," she said. "Right now, that's survival." She knew his rank. That detail landed harder than the gunfire. Fletcher's mind raced despite his efforts to slow it. She wasn't a random Allied sniper who'd stumbled onto a firefight. She wasn't some lucky coincidence drifting through the swamp. She knew who they were. She knew where they were. She knew the terrain, the enemy layout, and somehow their exact condition. And she was alone. Another shot. Another voice cut short. The enemy fire changed rhythm again, shorter bursts, less controlled. Someone shouted an order, then another, overlapping, panicked. Fletcher had heard this sound before, but never from this direction. It was the sound of certainty collapsing. Hayes leaned in, barely whispering, "Cap, this doesn't make sense." "No," Fletcher murmured back, "it doesn't." The radio hissed softly, then her voice returned, closer now. Not physically, just clearer. "You've got a jamming unit northwest of your position. Mobile, vehicle mounted. It's been masking your distress calls. I'm moving to take it out." "You're exposed," Fletcher said without thinking. Another pause, this one longer. "Captain," she replied, "I've been exposed since I woke up this morning." The line went dead. For a moment the gunfire resumed, heavy, blind, indiscriminate. Rounds tore through reeds and shattered ice, sending shards flying like glass. Fletcher ducked lower, wrapping an arm protectively over Brooks' head. The enemy was guessing now, firing at shadows, at fear. Then it stopped again. Completely. Seconds passed, 10, 20. Each one stretched thin. Fletcher's breath slowed. His heartbeat, loud in his ears, began to settle into something steadier. He hated this part. The waiting. The not knowing whether hope was real or just another way to die disappointed. The radio chirped. "Jamming unit neutralized," she said. "You should have comms now." As if on cue, Fletcher's display lit up. Channels flooded back to life. Headquarters answered on the second call. The helicopter was already airborne, 12 minutes out. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. She transmitted coordinates next. A landing zone 600 meters south. Fletcher studied the route quickly, already seeing the problem. Open ground, narrow paths, enemies still scattered throughout the area. "We've got a wounded man who can't walk," Fletcher said, "and we're low on ammo." "I know," she replied. No hesitation, no concern, just fact. "You'll move when I tell you. I'll handle the rest." That confidence should have unsettled him. Instead, it grounded him. Something about her certainty stripped away the noise in his head. There was no room left for doubt, just execution. While they waited, Fletcher became acutely aware of his own thoughts. Not tactics, not contingencies. Emotions he didn't have time for until now. Fear, not for himself but for the men around him. Anger at intelligence failures. And beneath it all, a strange, reluctant hope, the dangerous kind. The kind you don't let yourself feel unless you're willing to be crushed by it. The first enemy scout tried to reposition from the west. He didn't make it 3 steps. The second one dropped moments later, from a completely different direction. "They're trying to flank," Vega murmured. "They won't succeed," she said calmly. "They're improvising. That tells me they didn't expect resistance." Fletcher frowned. "Resistance?" "Yes," she replied. "They expected a cleanup." The words landed like a weight. This hadn't been a battle. It had been a scheduled ending. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The enemy presence thinned visibly. Engines started somewhere deeper in the marsh. Retreat, not organized, urgent, afraid. Fletcher had never witnessed that before, not against trained fighters, not like this. "All Viper elements," her voice returned. "Prepare to move in 5 seconds." Fletcher hoisted Brooks onto his shoulders, teeth gritted against the pain. Brooks stirred weakly but didn't protest. Hayes moved to point. Pierce took rear security. Vega adjusted his stance, injury or not. "Move." They went. Every step felt exposed. Every sound felt too loud. But every time an enemy shifted, every time a rifle lifted, a shot cut them down before it mattered. Fletcher stopped trying to predict it. He just trusted it, trusted her. At 300 meters, his legs burned. At 400, his vision blurred at the edges. Snow soaked through his gear, cold gnawing at his muscles. But he kept moving because the voice in his ear kept him moving. Left 30 meters, frozen pool ahead. They moved left. "Enemy right, don't stop, I have them." A shot, silence. At 500 meters, the helicopter's distant thrum reached them through the storm. Fletcher felt something crack inside his chest, not weakness. Relief, sharp and overwhelming. Then her voice shifted. "Hold." They froze. "There's a technical blocking your approach. Mounted gun, 4 crew, they've seen you." Fletcher scanned ahead, already knowing the truth. They couldn't assault that position, not like this, not now. "We can't," he started. "I know," she said gently. "Stay down." He wanted to ask where she was, how far, how exposed, but something told him she was already moving. Seconds passed. Then 4 shots, so fast they blurred into one sound. "Landing zone secure," she said. "Helicopter in 60 seconds, move now." They ran. As the helicopter descended, Fletcher glanced back one last time. He didn't expect to see her. He didn't. But for the first time since the ambush began, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt held. Why did survival feel heavier than the fight itself? The helicopter's rotors had barely faded into the storm when the weight finally hit him. Captain Marcus Fletcher sat strapped into the vibrating metal interior. Brooks laid out between their boots, Medic's hands still working, still refusing to trust that the bleeding had truly stopped. Red lights washed over familiar faces, Hayes staring at the floor like he'd misplaced something important, Vega gripping his rifle with white knuckles, Pierce blinking too often, as if afraid the moment he relaxed, the marsh would reclaim them. No one spoke. They'd been trained for this too, the aftermath, the quiet that followed violence. But this silence was different. It wasn't relief. It wasn't exhaustion. It was confusion. Because survival wasn't supposed to feel unreal. Fletcher kept replaying the voice in his head. Calm, precise, female, not commanding in the way officers were trained to be, but certain, as if hesitation simply wasn't an option she'd ever considered. He'd heard plenty of operators under pressure. None of them sounded like that. None of them sounded like they already knew the ending. Brooks coughed shallow and wet. The medic leaned closer, listening, adjusting. Alive, still alive. Fletcher closed his eyes for a second longer than necessary. He didn't pray. He wasn't that kind of man. But something inside him whispered a thank you anyway, quiet, directionless, unsure who it was meant for. The flight to the forward base blurred together. Debrief protocols kicked in automatically. Med checks, statements, secure rooms, words spoken, recorded, replayed. Fletcher answered questions with the discipline expected of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the swamp, back to the shots from nowhere, back to the voice that had threaded them through death like a needle through fabric. When the first intelligence officer asked, "Who provided Overwatch?" Fletcher paused. "I don't know," he said honestly. They didn't like that answer. Hours later, after Brooks was stabilized and the rest of the team cleared medically, Fletcher finally found himself alone in a quiet room, staring at a blank wall. His hands shook slightly. He pressed them together until they stopped. He wasn't afraid anymore. That scared him. Fear was familiar. Fear kept you sharp. Fear made sense. What he felt now was something else, a hollow awareness that the line between living and dying had been thinner than he'd ever allowed himself to admit, and that someone else had decided which side they stayed on. 3 days later, the general arrived. 2 stars on his collar, calm eyes, the kind of man who carried authority without raising his voice. Fletcher stood at attention as instructed, though part of him resented the formality. They weren't here to talk about posture. "Sit," the general said. He did. What followed was efficient, controlled, classified. The asset that intervened was not to be discussed outside specific channels. Her identity was sealed. Her involvement would not appear in official reports. The record would reflect Allied assistance and exceptional initiative by Viper team. Fletcher listened, jaw tight. "With respect, sir," he said finally, "my team deserves to know who saved their lives." The general didn't flinch. "They do know, they just won't know her name." "That doesn't feel right." "No," the general agreed quietly. "It rarely does." He explained necessity, operational integrity, long-term value. Fletcher understood all of it intellectually. That wasn't the problem. The problem was gratitude with nowhere to go. When Fletcher relayed the decision to his team, no one argued. Hayes shrugged once. Vega nodded. Pierce just looked away. Brooks, pale but awake, broke the silence. "She knew my name," he said softly. "On the radio, when I was fatting out. She told me to hold on." That detail sat heavy between them. 2 weeks later, Fletcher wrote the letter. He didn't rush it. He chose each word carefully, knowing none of them would ever be read. But writing it mattered. Names mattered. Futures mattered. He folded the paper and locked it away, not because it was classified, but because it was sacred. 3,000 miles away, Alina Cruz woke to the sound of machines she hated. Beeping, humming, controlled environments. Hospitals always felt louder than battlefields to her. Too much time to think, too much stillness. Her hands were wrapped in thick bandages. Her left shoulder burned dully beneath immobilization straps. A dull ache settled into her bones, the kind that came not from wounds, but from cold. The kind that lingered long after hypothermia released its grip. She stared at the ceiling and exhaled slowly. She was alive. Again. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought inevitability. The doctor told her she was lucky, that another few minutes in that water would have stopped her heart, that most people didn't come back from ice like that. She smiled politely and said nothing. Most people didn't crawl out because 4 men were depending on them. A knock came at the door. She already knew who it would be. The handler never wore a uniform, never carried rank on his chest. He existed in the same space she did, unmarked, deniable, forgettable by design. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I misjudged the ice," she replied. "Won't make that mistake again." He pulled a chair closer. "The SEAL team made it home, all 4. "I know," she said. "I monitored the extraction." He nodded. "The wounded one will recover fully." Good, she thought, just good. "We need to talk about the marsh," he continued. She turned her head slightly, finally looking at him. "What about it?" "You weren't tasked to that operation." "I wasn't prohibited either." "You took initiative." "I answered a call," she said evenly, "even if they didn't know they were making one." He studied her for a moment. "You're becoming a problem." She didn't bristle, didn't react. She'd heard this before, after Kandahar, after Mogadishu, after a dozen moments where lives were saved but paperwork was complicated. "I'm effective," she said. "Problems can be solved, death can't." That's not how oversight sees it. "I don't work for oversight." The handler sighed, rubbing his temple. "There will be questions, quiet ones, about how you knew, about why you were there, about the resources you used. They won't get answers. That's the issue." She closed her eyes briefly. Fatigue washed over her in a wave she couldn't fight anymore. "What's the outcome?" He leaned back. "You recover, then you disappear again." She opened her eyes. "Until the next time." "Yes." A faint smile touched her lips. "Of course." Because somewhere, even now, another team was stepping into terrain that looked safe on a screen. Another plan was unfolding perfectly, right until it didn't. Another radio would fill with static and breath and fear. And when it did, she would answer. Not because she wanted recognition. Not because she believed herself invincible. But because she understood something most people didn't. That sometimes, the difference between tragedy and survival wasn't firepower or luck. It was someone willing to act before permission arrived. She stared at her bandaged hands, remembering the ice breaking beneath her weight, the shock that stole her breath, the voice in her own head telling her to let go. She hadn't, because 4 men needed her not to. And that, she knew, would never change. What happens when the world moves on, but you do? 6 weeks after the marsh, Captain Marcus Fletcher sat in a windowless briefing room, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes fixed on a digital map that refused to tell the truth. The lines and symbols were clean. Too clean. According to the display, Viper Team had executed a flawless withdrawal under pressure with limited assistance from allied elements. No mention of panic. No mention of blood freezing into the snow. No mention of a woman's voice cutting through static and changing the shape of the fight. Fletcher listened as analysts spoke around him, their words careful, rehearsed. Questions were asked in neutral tones. Answers were recorded, categorized, stripped of anything that couldn't be verified on paper. He answered when spoken to. He didn't argue. He'd already learned which truths survived rooms like this. But inside, the memory refused to flatten. "We were dead," he said quietly at one point, breaking the rhythm of scripted inquiry. A few heads turned. There was no maneuver left, no fire superiority, no escape route, Fletcher continued, voice steady but firm. What happened out there wasn't luck or coincidence. Someone intervened who shouldn't have been able to. One officer adjusted his glasses. No friendly units were operating in your sector at that time. "I'm aware of what your records say." Another pause, another note taken, another truth redirected. The lead intelligence officer leaned forward slightly. "Captain, let me ask you something. If an asset exists whose effectiveness depends entirely on remaining unacknowledged, would it serve anyone to make her visible?" Fletcher thought of the shots, the angles, the way the voice never wavered, not even once. "No," he admitted, "it wouldn't." The officer nodded, satisfied. "Then we understand each other." The briefing ended without ceremony. No handshake, no resolution, just silence and doors that closed softly behind him. Outside, the sun felt unfamiliar. Fletcher blinked against the light, momentarily disoriented. He'd spent years moving between extremes, dark to bright, chaos to quiet, but this felt different. The world had continued while he was pinned in that marsh, waiting to see if he'd be allowed to keep breathing. His team waited near the vehicle. Hayes leaned against the door, arms crossed. Vega stood with his injured leg slightly favored but stubbornly unassisted. Pierce watched the parking lot, eyes scanning out of habit. Brooks sat on the hood, cane resting against his knee, looking stronger than he had any right to this soon. "Well?" Brooks asked. Fletcher exhaled. According to the official record, we saved ourselves. Hayes snorted. Vega shook his head. Pierce said nothing. Brooks stared at the ground for a long moment. "That's okay," he said finally. "I don't need it written down to know what happened." They drove in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. Then Brooks spoke again, voice quiet but steady. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Fletcher glanced at him in the mirror. "What?" "That she stayed," Brooks said. "She could have broken contact once we were moving, could have vanished, but she didn't. She stayed until the very end." No one argued, because that detail mattered more than they'd admitted out loud. Across the country, Elena Cruz stood on a balcony outside the medical wing, wrapped in a jacket she hadn't chosen, watching clouds move across a pale sky. Her body still ached in places doctors said were healing. Her shoulder remained stiff. Her hands trembled in the cold. She ignored all of it. Physical pain was easier than rest. A thin scar traced along her wrist now, pale against darker skin. The ice had bitten deep before she'd managed to pull herself out. The memory returned uninvited, the shock, the panic, the moment her body had screamed at her to stop fighting. She hadn't listened, because listening would have been easier. The handler joined her without announcement, standing beside her in silence for several seconds. He always did that. Let the quiet settle first. "There's chatter," he said eventually. She didn't look at him. "There's always chatter." "More than usual." She shrugged carefully, then let it talk. He studied her profile. "You push too close to the edge." She smiled faintly. "That's where the work is. That edge will take you someday." "Everything does." He had no answer for that. They stood together, watching the clouds. Elena wondered briefly, dangerously, what life would look like if she didn't disappear again, if she stayed visible, if she allowed herself to be known beyond a call sign and a calm voice. The thought made her uncomfortable. Visibility meant attachment. Attachment meant hesitation. Hesitation killed. A week later, she was cleared. Not officially, nothing about her ever was, but her equipment was returned. Her roots opened. Her name slipped back into the margins where it belonged. She packed methodically. No photos, no personal items, everything replaceable, everything light. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway, glancing once more at the bed she'd occupied, the ceiling she'd stared at while wondering, just for a moment, what it would be like to stop. She didn't stop. Because somewhere, patterns were repeating. Because somewhere, someone would trust a map that looked safe. Because somewhere, static would swallow a call for help. And when it did, someone needed to answer without waiting to be asked. Fletcher, meanwhile, returned to training rotations. New missions, new terrain, new faces, but the marsh stayed with him not as fear but as perspective. He watched his team more closely now, listened longer, spoke less. He understood something he hadn't before. That survival wasn't always about strength or planning. Sometimes it was about being seen, by someone who refused to look away. At night, when sleep came in fragments, Fletcher sometimes heard the voice again. Not in dreams, in memory, calm, unhurried. "I'm on you." And each time he felt the same thing. Not rescued. Protected. Because sometimes the difference matters. And sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply stays until the job is done. What do you do when the legend starts following you? The first time Fletcher realized the story hadn't ended, it was during a routine night exercise that should have meant nothing. They were running a low-visibility movement through wooded terrain, training, not combat. No stakes beyond evaluation. No enemy except timing and fatigue. And yet, as Fletcher lay prone overlooking a mock objective, that old tension crept back into his shoulders. The same feeling he'd had in the marsh just before the shooting started. Not fear, awareness. Something doesn't add up. He shook it off. Training scars, he told himself. You don't walk away from something like that without carrying it with you. But later, when Hayes approached him quietly and asked, "Cap, do you ever feel like we didn't actually leave that swamp?" Fletcher didn't answer right away. Because the truth was uncomfortable. None of them had. The name started circulating in fragments, not officially, never in briefings or reports, but in the spaces where operators talked without recording devices, between missions, over coffee that had gone cold. Night Viper, always spoken carefully, sometimes with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, sometimes with disbelief, always with respect. Most dismissed it as myth, a composite story, a way to make sense of surviving something you shouldn't have. But every now and then, Fletcher would hear a detail he recognized too well to be coincidence. A shot from an impossible angle, a calm female voice cutting through chaos, a team making it home when the math said they wouldn't. And every time his chest tightened. Because if the legend was real, and he knew it was, then that meant she was still out there. Still stepping into storms no one else could reach. Alina Cruz didn't hear the stories. She avoided places where stories were told. Her life existed in margins, between flights, between borders, between permissions that were never written down. She learned to live lightly, to leave no trace. The fewer connections you made, the easier it was to disappear when the work demanded it. But even she couldn't outrun memory. Sometimes when she lay awake in temporary quarters listening to unfamiliar sounds outside thin walls, the marsh returned. Not the gunfire, not the cold, the moment just before the ice broke, the instant when she'd known, absolutely, that she might not survive this one. That knowledge hadn't frightened her. What frightened her was how willing she'd been to accept it. She'd spent years telling herself she operated alone because that's how she was most effective. But the truth was more complicated. Alone meant accountable only to herself. Alone meant she didn't have to explain why she chose to act, or why she sometimes didn't hesitate where others would. But alone also meant there was no one to tell her to stop. The next operation came without warning. They always did. A convoy ambushed in mountainous terrain, communications degraded, extraction compromised. Not SEALs this time. Different unit, different flag, same pattern. The math was wrong again. Alina studied the feeds quietly, mapping terrain in her head, fingers tracing routes on a screen no one else could see. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Rushing made mistakes feel necessary. She inserted before dawn. Cold air, thin, sharp, familiar. She moved with the ease of someone who trusted her body more than her thoughts. By the time the first shots were fired, she was already in position. By the time the enemy realized they weren't alone, she was already relocating. She didn't announce herself this time. She didn't need to. By the time Allied air arrived, the ambush had collapsed. Survivors would later say it felt like someone had tilted the battlefield, that the pressure had lifted without explanation, that they'd been given time they hadn't earned. Alina vanished before anyone could ask questions. Back at base, Fletcher read the after-action summary out of habit. He didn't expect anything to stand out. Then he saw a line that made his breath hitch. Unknown Overwatch engagement, disrupted enemy maneuver. Unknown Overwatch. He closed the file slowly. That night, Fletcher sat alone longer than usual. He didn't drink. He didn't sleep. He just thought about patterns, about how many times survival bent in one direction instead of another, about how many lives continued forward because someone had chosen to intervene without being asked. He thought about Brooks, walking without a cane now, about Hayes's daughters, about Vega's parents, about futures that existed quietly, unaware of how close they'd come to not existing at all. Gratitude returned like a bruise you press on without realizing it's there. Alina's body finally forced her to slow down weeks later. It wasn't dramatic, no collapse, no mission gone wrong, just a tremor in her hands that wouldn't stop, a delay in reaction time she noticed before anyone else did, fatigue settling deeper than muscle or bone. She ignored it until she couldn't. The handler didn't scold her. He never did. He just slid a report across a table and said, "You're burning too hot." She didn't argue, she knew. "What happens if I stop?" she asked quietly. He considered the question. Someone else might answer the call. "Might," she echoed. "That's all any of us ever are," he said. "A maybe." That answer didn't satisfy her. Because she wasn't operating on maybes. She was operating on certainty, on knowing when to move before the math finished calculating, on choosing action when hesitation looked reasonable. She took the downtime she was given, but rest didn't come easily. Without missions, without the constant forward pull, the weight of what she carried pressed closer. Faces returned. Voices. The sound of men breathing into radios they weren't sure anyone could hear. She wondered, briefly, how long she could keep doing this before the cold finally won. Fletcher received an unexpected message weeks later. Not official, not classified, just a note passed quietly through channels he trusted. Another team made it out, similar circumstances. No name, no details. He didn't need them. He walked outside afterward, letting the air ground him. He thought about writing another letter, one he wouldn't send. He decided against it. Some debts weren't meant to be recorded. They were meant to be carried. Alina stood alone one evening on unfamiliar ground, watching the sun dip behind terrain she wouldn't remember long enough to miss. She adjusted her rifle, checked her gear, and took a slow breath. She wasn't fearless. She was tired. But tired didn't mean finished. Because somewhere, not far, never far enough, someone was moving into a place that looked quiet on a screen. Someone was trusting a plan that would unravel. Someone would need calm when everything else collapsed. And when that moment came, hesitation wouldn't help them. So she did what she always did. She moved. Not for recognition. Not for legend. Not because she believed she was unbreakable. But because sometimes the only moral choice is action. And sometimes strength isn't loud. It's simply still there when everything else leaves. Why do some people survive, while others are never even remembered? The question came to Captain Marcus Fletcher not in a firefight, not in a briefing room, but on an ordinary morning that should have meant nothing. He was standing in line for coffee, listening to idle conversation drift around him, when he caught himself thinking about how close all of this had come to never happening at all. This cup, this line, this unremarkable moment of being alive. The thought stayed with him longer than he liked. Life had resumed its rhythm, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Missions still came, training cycles still rotated, orders were still given and followed, but Fletcher had changed in ways no evaluation form could capture. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed the quiet ones in the room, the operators who didn't posture, who didn't brag, who carried themselves like they expected the world to test them at any moment. He'd learned what real competence sounded like. It didn't shout. Sometimes during long nights when sleep refused to settle, Fletcher would replay the marsh in reverse. Not the ambush, not the blood, the ending, the moment when survival tipped back in their favor, when the math had finally stopped adding up against them. He wondered how many times that same equation had played out elsewhere, unseen, unrecorded. How many lives had continued because someone had acted without needing credit. Alina Cruz moved through another city she wouldn't remember, another country that would blur into the rest. Her body still bore the quiet reminders of everything she'd endured. The cold never fully left her bones anymore. It lived there now, a constant ache beneath the surface. She'd learned to work around it, to accept it as the cost. She didn't think of herself as brave. Bravery implied choice. For her, it had become habit. The handler met her in a nondescript office, walls bare, lights too bright. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him, or maybe she was just better at noticing time. "There's talk of slowing you down," he said carefully. She smiled faintly. "There always is." "They're worried." She tilted her head. "About me." "About what you represent," he corrected. "You operate in the spaces where systems fail. That makes people uncomfortable." "Systems don't bleed," she replied. "People do." He sighed. "You can't keep carrying everything." "I'm not carrying it," she said quietly. "I'm preventing it." He watched her for a long moment. "One day," he said, "someone won't make it in time, not because you didn't try, just because the world is unfair." "I know. And when that happens—" She didn't answer right away. The truth wasn't simple. "When that happens," she said finally, "I'll grieve, and then I'll answer the next call." Because stopping wouldn't bring anyone back. Fletcher received news months later that Brooks had married. He attended the ceremony quietly, standing off to the side, watching laughter ripple through a future that nearly hadn't existed. Hayes brought his daughters. Vega's parents flew in. Pierce danced like a man who no longer felt time chasing him. No one spoke about the marsh. They didn't need to. Fletcher raised a glass during the toast and felt something settle inside him. Not closure, something steadier, acceptance. The understanding that gratitude didn't always need a recipient. Sometimes it was enough to live well. Elena watched a sunrise from a ridge line in a place the maps labeled unimportant. The light spilled slowly across the terrain, revealing nothing remarkable. Just land, just air, just quiet. She felt the familiar hum of awareness in her chest, the sense that something, somewhere, was about to go wrong. Her radio remained silent. For now, she adjusted her position anyway, checked her angles, prepared, because she'd learned that the absence of noise didn't mean safety. It meant the story hadn't reached its turning point yet. She thought briefly of the men from the marsh. She didn't know their faces. She'd never learned their voices beyond strained breathing and clipped call signs. But she knew their fear. She'd heard it. She carried it. She wondered if they ever thought of her. The answer didn't matter. Fletcher stood at a training range weeks later, watching new operators cycle through drills. One of them hesitated during a simulated crisis, froze just long enough for failure to register. Fletcher stepped forward, not to reprimand, but to guide. "Slow down," he said quietly. "Listen, the situation will tell you what it needs." The young operator nodded, breathing hard. Fletcher realized he was passing something on, not tactics, perspective, the understanding that the loudest answer was rarely the right one. Somewhere, Elena moved again. Another border crossed, another insertion executed cleanly, another moment where the unseen hand nudged events just enough to keep disaster from finalizing its claim. No one wrote her name down. No one thanked her. Somewhere, an after-action report used the word fortunate. She almost laughed when she read that line later. Fortunate implied chance. She knew better. The years pressed forward. Fletcher would eventually retire. Elena would eventually slow. Time spared no one, not even those who seemed to defy it. But the impact they left didn't fade with them. Fletcher taught younger leaders to respect silence, to value preparation over bravado, to understand that sometimes the most important person in a fight was the one you never saw. Elena continued answering calls until one day she didn't. Not because she was gone, but because the world, for a brief moment, didn't need her. She stood still that day, letting the quiet exist without filling it, letting herself be human instead of vigilant. It felt strange, almost wrong, but peaceful. Somewhere, a team returned home without ever knowing how close they'd come to not doing so. Somewhere else, a family slept soundly, unaware of the thin margin that separated their joy from grief. And somewhere in the distance, a radio remained silent. For now, Because the truth about people like Alina Cruz was never written in records or medals or whispered legends. It lived in absence, in disasters that didn't quite happen, in funerals that never needed planning, in ordinary mornings, in weddings, in coffee lines, in the quiet privilege of being alive and not knowing why. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who refuse to be seen. Sometimes, the most moral choice leaves no evidence at all. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts and disappears back into the silence, waiting for the next voice that needs to hear. I'm on you.